So, this story didn't happen to me, but I heard it many times when I was growing up. My grandparents owned 80 acres about 20 miles east of Snowflake, Arizona. They had moved to the land in the early 80s after my grandfather had retired from the mine in San Manuel, Arizona. The land was pretty barren. I don't know why they chose to buy it. Red sandstone bluffs and dry washes cut across the landscape, dotted with juniper and cedar trees. And red sand was everywhere. I suppose at the time the land was cheap. They didn't have close neighbors. The closest was about a mile away, which was my aunt and uncle. The next closest neighbor was a man named Stoddard. I never got his first name, just Stoddard. He lived about 4 miles from my grandparents at the base of one of the sandstone bluffs. He was an asshole rancher, from what my grandparents said. Thought he owned everything and was entitled to do whatever he wanted. More than once, my grandpa had caught Stoddard cutting my grandfather's barbed wire fence to let his cattle onto my grandpa's land to graze. Now this area is full of ancient Anasazi Pueblo ruins. Most of them have been destroyed by ranchers with backhoes trying to find pots to sell. I'm sure Stoddard was one of them. So the story goes that one day, after losing a calf, Stoddard stumbles upon a cave sealed by a giant slab of sandstone against one of the sides of the bluffs. Curious about it, he used a backhoe to remove the boulder. After going inside, he discovers that it's an Anasazi burial cave. I'm sure he was delighted. He starts taking things from the burial cave and selling them. Well, from that moment on, he has some pretty crappy luck. First, he lost about $500,000 in the stock market. Then his cattle all got a disease and died. In financial ruin, he gets another blow. His wife gets diagnosed with an extremely rare disease and passes away. Then, Stoddard got thrown from his horse and lost his ability to walk. This all happened within just a couple of years. He tells everybody he knows that he's cursed from the burial grounds. They laugh it off. He abandons all of his belongings and leaves one night. This was all in the late 80s. Fast forward a couple of years since Stoddard abandoned his ranch house. The land and house are bought by a man from California. He puts the ranch house up for rent. My aunt is pregnant with her first son and decides to move from San Manuel to Snowflake to be closer to her parents. Stoddard's house is fully furnished. The aunt and her husband move in. He finds a job working nights at the local paper mill. It's very creepy out there at night. At first it seems like a nice little place. Creepy at night, but not too bad. But then weird things start happening. My aunt starts hearing faint chanting and drumming at night. She brushes it off. She had a hippie neighbor, lived about a mile away up on the bluffs, so she just figured it was them doing hippie stuff. But she can't help but feel like somebody is always watching her. Or something. She starts having nightmares, but she chalks it up to being alone and hormones, you know. She finally tells my grandpa about it, and he loans her his dog to keep her company at night. She drives the dog out there, and he refuses to get out of the truck. The hair on his back is straight up, and he's growling. She gets freaked out, but figures maybe he saw a rabbit or something, and she hauls him into the house. The dog just stares at the door and growls. That night, he growls and barks all night long. The drums and the chanting are louder. The next morning, my aunt finds human bare footprints all around the house. So this goes on for about a week. The dog barks and growls at night. She has nightmares when she can get some sleep. And the house is surrounded by footprints in the morning. The chanting and the drums keep getting louder. Finally, feeling like she's losing her mind, she asks my grandma to come over and stay the night with her. Grandma is more than happy to. After finishing her chores, she heads over planning to make my aunt a nice meal. This is late in the afternoon. My aunt lays down for a nap, comfortable now that my grandma is there. My grandma decides to take a little walk at the base of the bluff. My grandma was a very religious person. She was very active in the church, and she devoted her entire life to Jesus. As she was out on her walk, she always liked to look for pottery shards or arrowheads. A little ways from the house, she gets a very unnerving feeling that something is watching her. She said it made her skin crawl. She could sense something evil. So my grandma prays and walks back to the house, pleading the blood of Christ the entire way. She decides not to say anything to my aunt, who is awake, because she's already frightened. She tells my aunt that maybe it's a better idea to stay at her house, Grandma's house, that night, and my aunt agrees. By the time my aunt gets her stuff together, the sun is about to go down behind the bluff. Grandma, aunt, and dog all load up in the pickup. Grandma turns the key. Nothing. She tries again. Nothing. Not being very mechanically inclined, my grandma goes into the house to call Grandpa, but he doesn't answer. It was at that point that she remembers that he was going into town that afternoon. Dang. They unload and go back into the house, waiting for Grandpa to get home. Now it's night, no moon, pitch dark. The dog begins its low growl. The sounds of chanting and drums begin, faint at first, but growing louder. My grandma begins to pray in between calling my grandpa. Remember, this is the time before cell phones. They hear something howl outside. Not a coyote howl. Something more ominous and terrifying. Something is moving, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women are beyond terrified at this point. Finally, after turbo-dialing Grandpa, he finally answers. My grandma is frantic. Elvin, something is outside the house. Get here now. For what seems like hours, they wait for Grandpa's truck to come over the hill. Finally, they see his headlights. Before Grandpa flies into the driveway, something runs across the road in front of him. His headlights illuminate an animal, or something. Grandpa jumps out of the truck, yelling for the women to get the hell in. He unloads a couple of shots in the general vicinity of the animal. They haul ass down the dirt road towards Grandma's house. My aunt, against her better judgment, looks back and sees red eyes watching them. The next day, my grandpa and uncle head over to the house. Grandpa verified that all around the house there were bare footprints in the sand, along with very large what appeared to be coyote tracks. Needless to say, my aunt and grandma never went back to that house. My aunt won't even talk about it. I made the mistake of staying up too late and listening to the adults talk once. My aunt moved in with my grandparents, and my grandma swears that she would see those red eyes at night, stalking the edge of her property. As far as I know, other people have tried living in Stoddard's house, but they all leave within a month or two. That whole area is cursed. I always hated going out there. It's an oppressive, evil feeling, even at my grandparents'. I have more stories about that cursed land involving other family members, but those are stories for another time. This happened in Costa Mesa, California. I was homeless at the time and under immense stress as a result. I've had a dozen or so very strange things happen in my life, but this one was truly upsetting. I was walking my usual route, which was around the campus of the community college that I attended. Even still, I had only recently quit my job and moved out of a house I was renting a room in. Admittedly, I am something of an antisocial, misanthropic, generally depressed person that feels the weight of the world seemingly heavier than my peers. But I'm an A student, and I think a troubled life has lent a heavy hand in these detrimental character traits. I'm being verbose only because I think, or hope, there's a certain genuine nature to someone who can see potential red flags in their own recollections. But I would swear to my creator that the following testimony is 100% accurate. So, I was walking and approaching a crosswalk. Down the adjacent sidewalk, I see a woman 30 yards away, walking up to a grocery bag on the sidewalk, 10 feet in front of her. She's already carrying two in her hands, one in each. I go to help her, as I have nothing to do, and she seemed old. As I approached her, this was confirmed. At most, she stood 5 feet, probably 2 to 3 inches shorter. She looked to be about 60 to 70 years old. She was generally unkempt. I asked her if she could use some help. She said with a heavy accent, "Sure," and indicated her destination was on the other side of the street, where I had planned on crossing anyway. I was handed one of her bags and insisted on taking the other, leaving just the one that she'd been walking up on, now at our feet. We start heading to the corner. The bags were heavy enough for me to look inside. It looked to be 4 mangoes in each bag, but I remember thinking it was easily 10 pounds. We get to the crosswalk and she starts hitting the buttons super fast, like her feet were on fire. At this point, the bags felt as if they had doubled in weight. We get to the signal and I make it no more than halfway through the intersection, and the bags feel every bit of 80 to 100 pounds each. I'm 6'1", and I'm in good shape. I could not believe what was happening. I sincerely didn't think I was going to make it. I looked back at her, and she has both hands supporting her bag, taking half strides. She puts on the most disturbing, full-tooth smile and said, "Too heavy?" I remember the fear of her face made me turn around more than anything. I made it in one single step to the other side of the street, and I had to drop the bags. I remember the strangest of all was that the plastic handles hadn't been compromised whatsoever. No stretching, nothing. She was click-clacking in half steps, and at this point I was tearing up because I couldn't understand what was happening. She dropped her bag by my two. She looked at me, smiled wide, full teeth again, and said, "Too heavy? You stop here or keep going?" I said, weeping, "I'm so sorry. I can't go any farther." Her smile somehow got even bigger, and she said, "Okay." I began to sprint back across the street to get away from her. I was ashamed and terrified. I looked back to where she was, and she was now hoisting each bag, one by one, under her chin with both hands, walking it 3 or 4 steps, putting it down and then grabbing the next, carrying it 3 or 4 steps, over and over. She was walking into a place for the developmentally disabled. It was a community for mentally disabled people in the area. I walked away, weeping as I saw her carry those 3 bags, now no more than 4 feet at a time. But I also had no desire to help her anymore. I'm still bewildered and terrified. I don't know what else to add. I know it sounds made up or phony, or like I'm making up for being a terrible person. But I'm telling you, those bags went from holding just a few mangoes each to feeling like they were holding so much more. I don't know how that happened, and it's almost like she knew somehow. I don't know what happened that day, but it did. And if anybody knows how to explain it, please let me know. This is a story that happened to me years ago that I never really talk about much. I thought it might be interesting to tell this story. When I was a teenager, I made money by babysitting. On this particular night, I was working at a house a few minutes from my home, so I had been able to work later than usual. The family had 2 little girls that I was watching, around 4 to 7 years old. First, to give a bit of background on what the home looked like, which will be important later. The house had 2 floors and 2 staircases that led to the upstairs. One set was off the kitchen, and the other was in the foyer. This home had an alarm system that would beep 3 times when any door was opened, although it would not say which door it was. I was sitting in the kitchen at around 11 p.m. and coloring to pass the time at the kids' table. The parents had said they would be home between 11:30 and midnight, and I was starting to get antsy to go home. I heard the alarm for the door and got up, expecting to see the parents coming in. When they didn't, I went back to what I was doing. About 15 minutes later, it went off again. This time I felt a little creeped out, so I went around checking all the doors, which I all found to be shut tight and locked. I sat back down, figuring that there must be some kind of glitch in the system. Within about a minute, the door alarm went off twice, as if 2 doors had been opened in quick succession, and as I stood up, I heard a little girl screaming bloody murder. I raced up the stairs into the girls' shared room, and I found them both sleeping soundly. I checked all the nooks and crannies of their room, and I remember feeling that the only thing that seemed different was that the book that I had read to them was on the floor instead of on the bookshelf. I ended up checking the stairs and the other rooms as I felt pretty unsure of the girls' safety, but I found nothing, and all the doors were still locked. I ended up sitting back down in the kitchen feeling stupid, and not long after, the alarm beeped once, really loudly, which I had never heard before, and the panel didn't seem to give an explanation for what this meant. After that, everything stopped, and the parents came home not long after. I managed to convince myself at the time that I was just imagining things. But after all this time, I can still remember the fearful scream very clearly. Nothing too exciting, but something that I've never been able to forget. I live in Oregon, specifically Yamhill County, a moderately sized, mostly rural county. I'm half Native American, half Caucasian, with my tribe being an Algonquin-speaking people of the Anishinaabe. Unfortunately, as I live in Oregon, and the tribe is located around Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Canada, and there's a pandemic going on right now, I haven't been able to visit my specific tribe as of yet. I'm over 18, although I don't want to disclose my age for obvious reasons. I live with my mom, who is where I get my Caucasian from, and my sister. My dad passed away about 2.5 years ago. We have 3 dogs of varying sizes and 4 outdoor cats. In the part of Oregon I live in, you're never more than 10 minutes away from a forest, 20 minutes from a mountaintop, and even in the cities there's plenty of forestry. I live just outside of one of these towns, only a short, several-minute drive, but far enough to where light pollution doesn't heavily affect me, and I can see the stars rather clearly. I've lived at this house since I was a kid, and although I've always gotten the creeps about this place, since it's next to a giant forest, it's been a while since anything that I could categorize as paranormal has happened to me. I'm pretty skeptical and not so superstitious. I think science can probably explain about 95% of the world's mysteries, although I've seen some stuff that I have no rational explanation for, and the things that have happened to me over the past 3 days fall solidly into that category. I know a decent bit about skinwalkers. They come from the Ute and Navajo tribe legends, being witches that are the antithesis to medicine men, commonly found around the Four Corners areas of the United States, on and around Navajo reservations. But my knowledge is limited to different internet retellings of legends, so I only know a few baseline rules. Don't fall for their imitation voices. If you smell dead, rotting meat, you need to get out of there immediately. Don't acknowledge its presence directly. Don't say its name out loud unless you want to attract one. And if you want to harm one, you'll need white ashes, like that from burnt wood or burnt sage. If you suspect one being near you or hunting you, and if you happen to spot its true human identity, then you can say its name and accuse it of being a skinwalker to kill it. How much of all that is true I'm still unsure of for a number of reasons. The largest being that I don't think any of the videos that I watched were made by natives who would have more intimate knowledge of these creatures. But I could be talking out of my ass on that end for all I know. Some background for this property. According to the previous owners, who are part of a family who have lived here for generations, there was once a log cabin built here on top of a native burial ground, which is also on a long, inactive volcano. Sounds cliche, I know, but it's absolutely true, near as I can tell from the burial ground part, and the inactive volcano part is completely true. There have been a number of odd, unexplainable phenomenon, which I'll keep short. The most notable include 12-foot metal doors belonging to a car painting booth being shook intensely by absolutely nothing, an old 50s metal gas or oil can flying up from behind a ton of junk and flying directly at one of my dad's friends, a running sound followed up by the mirror door in my parents' bedroom being shattered at 3 a.m. one night, the exact same time that my dad's best man died. Needless to say that while I haven't encountered any Bigfoot or Mothman, I have seen some stranger things that I have no logical explanation for. The property I live on is around 10 acres in size. The house is decently large, with a one-car garage and office, which is where my sister is currently chilling out at. The office is next to the garage. There's a large metal garage about 200 yards east from the house. The smaller garage and the house have motion lights all around their perimeter for proper illumination, in case anything or anyone gets near the home. But the larger garage only has a halogen bulb outside its main door, and that went out last week. Now at night, that entire area of the property is pitch black. The house has 3 doors, 2 on a porch to the front yard and driveway, 1 to the laundry room and into the backyard. On the eastmost side is the living room, with 9 windows and one of the doors, a kitchen area with a view onto the porch, another living room type area, and then a hallway to the bathrooms and bedrooms. The office in the smaller garage has 2 entrances, one heading directly to the backyard, which is sliding glass, and 2 partially iron, partially glass doors that head into the garage itself. The metal garage was built over the aforementioned cabin and has an attic that spans its entire length. It has a car lift, a paint booth that can fit a limousine, a bathroom, and a scaffolding with a heater, which is where the gas can flew from. Around 15 feet behind the shop is a large forest that I've never stepped into due to there being a crazy old man living in it. While I haven't stepped into it, my sister and her friends have headed in a few times, each time returning with odd objects. Though they haven't gone into the forest for several years, I remember them bringing out stuff like statues, animal bones, and weird rocks. Aside from these, the only things we see out here animal-wise are does and baby deer, just passing on through our yard to get to the forest. Now for the current events. At around 4 a.m. on Saturday night, I was preparing to go to bed in my family living room. My room is painted black, and being the summer here, it gets ridiculously hot during the day, and I don't have good AC at the moment, so I'm sleeping out in the living room. As I was about to sleep, I heard the cats fighting, something that's not too odd. They're mostly males and get pretty riled up. But then I heard something else. 3 distinct knocks on one of my front doors. This immediately freaked me out for a few reasons. For one, it was 4 a.m. and pitch black outside, and these were knocks that were far too loud for any animal to make, and sounded far too high for it to be an animal too. Second, my motion tracker lights were still off. After the knocking, my dogs headed toward the other front door. This one is partially iron, partially glass, like those in the office, and that's when they lost their minds barking. Something they only ever do when they see something they don't recognize. I locked all my windows, closed all the blinds, and just sat on the couch bed. In my living room, facing out toward the front yard, there's a half-circle shaped window with no blinds that allows me to see when the motion trackers turn on or off. I sat, staring at this window for about an hour and a half, until they finally came on, and the sun came up. I didn't have the courage to go look as to what caused the lights to trigger. From the stories I've heard of skinwalkers, I wasn't taking a single risk. The next morning I asked my mom if she had heard the knocking on the door, to get a disturbing answer from her and my sister. My mom had also heard the knocking, but also heard it on her windows to the bedroom. And my sister heard the knocking on the sliding glass door to the office. I knew then that this was something that had knocked multiple times, as there's no way I could have mistaken the tapping on my door for something tapping on my sister's door. While the sun was up, my sister and I bought some sage since, from what I know of it, it wards off skinwalkers, but my mom misplaced it before we could burn it. By the time we realized we couldn't find it, the shop that we went to had closed, so we just had to hope that nothing worse would come that night. The second night was much more disturbing than the first. While I didn't spot anything, I heard a loud ambient noise from the woods. The nearest broad comparison I could make is like how a city sounds in the dead of night when there's construction. But this sounded more organic and natural in origin in some strange way. Another much more niche comparison would be the song Cave of the Past from Earthbound, as it's the only song I can think of that fit the ambiance. I heard this ambient noise for around half an hour while I walked my dogs in the front yard. And while I wanted to just stay inside and drown out my paranoia with some anime, my mom made me take the dogs out, claiming there's nothing out there that can harm you, in spite of the fact that she had heard the knocking the night before too. As I was walking the last dog, I heard something from the forest to the east. Chanting. I only heard about one short sentence in some dialect that I couldn't discern, but that was all I needed to hear in order to head inside and lock everything up again. From there, I could hear the ambience even inside my house, and I was up again until the sun crested over the hills. One more thing about this night, though. There was a light that refused to go out. It was one of the motion trackers on the one-car garage, and each time I would look out at it, I would see nothing, but yet it stayed on through the entire night. In order for it to do that, something would have had to have been pacing in front of it. Finally, tonight, I woke up late, as staying up until sunrise tends to make you do, so I forgot to get sage before I headed to work. Once I came home from work, it was already dark out, as I get off by the time the sun is setting. Around 2 a.m., I was taking out my dogs for the last time. Tonight, there wasn't any ambient noise or chanting, and I stayed strictly to the small plot of yard directly in front of my house. But as I was once again taking out the last dog, I heard a noise to the east, and this scared the crap out of me. It sounded like something large had been knocked over or thrown down, something that was loud enough for me to hear hundreds of yards away. Immediately I turned toward the noise and tugged on my dog's leash to drag them inside, keeping my back to the illuminated sections of my yard while I went inside. I've locked my doors, my car, and everything else that I can, and I've tried ignoring everything, but I feel that I need help. These events are slowly escalating, and I only fear that tomorrow could bring a full-on encounter. I have been unable to sleep again thanks to this, and the fact that it's happened 3 nights in a row is a little disturbing. Now, while I think it could be a skinwalker, I also think it could be a Wendigo. They're similar, and Wendigos come from Algonquin-speaking tribes, which my tribe is a part of. If it was the latter, though, I have a hunch it would have made itself more known already. Whereas with a skinwalker, I think it could be trying to lure me out into the darkness of the shop. I've been trying to get a hold of a medicine man here in Oregon, but all I can find on Google is old articles. It's almost like it refuses to let me find the help that I need so desperately. If anybody knows where I can find one to come and bless the house and the property, I would be elated to get this over with. These past few nights alone have been hellish, and I would rather not have to see for myself the horrors that I've heard described many times. Tonight when I came home from work, I heard a hissing and growling from the woods behind the garage, and later as I was taking my dogs out, I spotted eyes about 7 or 8 feet up, directly in front of the big metal garage. At this rate, I fear that when I come home tomorrow, or Thursday, or the next day, it'll just wait out on the road for me. I really, really need help. It was Labor Day of 2015. My mother, my wife, my 3 children, and I all went to a very remote cabin that we rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, so it had the cabin and 3 other sheds or outbuildings. I'll try to keep it short, but this is a truly bizarre story that I still can't figure out. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and then decided to walk a couple hundred yards down to the river, barefoot or sandals with shorts for all of us. We got down to the pebbled shore and were playing and throwing rocks when I realized that there were 1-foot-long snakes everywhere. My wife, Mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance from them, I went back with a water bottle and caught one in it to see what it was. Turns out, we'd been standing in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, they surely would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin, and my mom and I went for a walk alone while my wife calmed the kiddos and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my kids and my wife were inside with the doors and windows entirely shut up, even though we had opened everything to cool the place off. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards from the cabin, huffing and puffing at the wife and kids on the front porch and eating. It was down by the river, about 30 yards or so down the hill, when he poked his head up and over. A few hours go by, and in that time an ATV passes by 3 times, with 2 of those inbred-looking freaks on it. Each time they stopped in front of the gate onto the property and stared at us or the cabin. Keep in mind, we're 2 hours into the wilderness in Idaho, with not a sight of a person the entire trip, except them. We decided it was bedtime for the kiddos because it was pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly healthy and active to having a fever of over 103. He was slightly foaming at the mouth, and then eventually became completely unresponsive, all in a very short amount of time. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door of the cabin and started loading the 2 cars by the light of the porch bulb and the headlights on the cars, both of which were parked facing the gate. That's when all 3 of us adults heard about 4 to 6 large and very heavy animals running all around the cabin and the property. There was one on the right side of the house, while I was exiting, that I could hear pacing back and forth and breathing heavily. I made everybody stay inside and close the door every time I went out to transfer stuff to the cars, which took me about 4 or 5 trips. I had a stick and a big pot that I was smacking as hard and as loud as I could on each and every trip, and I was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I was all done loading, I took each kid out individually and loaded them up between the 2 cars. Then I escorted my mom out, and then my wife. My wife and I were in the lead car, so we pulled up out of the gate, and for some stupid reason, I felt that I just needed to go close the gate. So I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it and my mom's car, about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now, this gate was literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered 0 protection between me and the animals out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud padded footsteps walking up to me, directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet. Then I see eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I've ever heard in my life erupts. I turned and ran so fast I swear I must have jumped from where I was straight into the driver's seat. I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving. Unfortunately, it gets even weirder though. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son, and we kept having this horrible, evil doom feeling cast a shadow over us. I looked down and realized I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle in my cup holder. So I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we hear our son softly crying. We realize he's responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was so sad to leave. He couldn't even remember the last hour or so. Quick backstory for what's next. My mother was about 58 years old at the time. She's been a Jehovah's Witness my whole life, plus many years before that. And she's the last person in the world to believe in signs, evil spirits, or omens. The next day, my mom broke down extremely badly, sobbing her eyes out, hardly able to speak. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip, came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said that she knew a lot of bad things happened at the outpost and that it was full of evil. Most of all, she said, "One of your kids died in the dream." I swear on my life to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me or anyone else. She lives her life now with the guilt that she has willingly ignored her nightmare to put us all in that situation, nearly taking one of her grandkids away from the world. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. It was a nightmare. Anybody would have ignored it. I know this all sounds crazy, but a week later on the news were reports of a wolf pack in the area. Wolves and bears may not usually coexist in harmony, I don't know, but for all I know, they do share territories and respect each other. This outpost station was about an hour and a half into the wilderness from Loman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify the animals actually exist around there. Sadly, I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre- and early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have a half sleeve of the wilderness and trees on my left arm, but with that said, we don't go into the mountains anymore. Thanks for hearing everything out. I don't really care if you believe me or not. This is a real story, and it's still very visceral for my family and I. That night changed a lot of things for us, going forward. I hope someday I can feel comfortable in the mountains again, but as for now, I just don't. I bought a haunted doll on a whim, and it's been an interesting week. Esther, which is what the previous owner said her name was, has been here since Wednesday, and we've already had little things happen. Most notably, if we leave the lights on as we leave the house, they're off by the time we get home. Doors that were closed open just slightly, as though somebody's peeking inside. Doors that were open are closed. Also, I've watched a doorknob turn and a door open twice, when I'm fully awake, standing at my desk at the time. My wife and I will have a lot of conversations along the lines of, "Did you come home during the day?" "Nope, I've been at work all day." "Okay, because I know I left the bathroom light on and the door closed, but I came home to the light off and the door open. The bedroom door is open too." This is notable because we always keep our bedroom door closed. We have an old cat that likes to sneak in and do their business under the bed. In my office during the winter, I run a space heater to keep it warmer for the reptiles. I do keep the door ajar so that the cats and dogs can come in and out. This morning, I most certainly left the door open as there were 3 cats and a dog in here sleeping. When I got up, I was asked if I knew that I had trapped 3 cats and a dog in my office by shutting the door. I said, I left the door open before I went back to sleep because I knew they were in there. "Oh, well, the door was open when I got up." There's been one instance of, "Are you humming?" "What? No." well, someone's humming. We've also had numerous incidents of a light being turned off that we had left on. And this morning I woke up to the bedroom ceiling fan being on when it had most certainly been off when I went to sleep. It takes the wall switch and pulling the light chain to have it on, and, well, no lights. And I'm 100% sure that I didn't do that before I went to sleep. Nothing scary, can't say I've ever felt unsettled by any of the above, because I grew up in a house with the ghost of my great-grandmother, and I'm sort of used to things like that. I'm not worried about anything actually scary happening. The woman that we got the doll from was very clear that the spirit attached was pretty much nice, very motherly, which I suppose explains turning off the lights that we leave on. Apparently it's a middle-aged woman who's really more interested in plants and pets than in causing problems for or scaring or playing tricks on people. The worst she does, according to the lady who sold her, is hum a little random tune and occasionally manifest physically, or if you have plants in one area of your house, the doll might move to sit near them, which I haven't seen, but like I said, we have heard the humming. That's partially why I settled on that one. Just to err on the side of I don't want a doll moving around the house, we have dogs that might mistake it for a toy, I put a small succulent garden next to her, and I set her near a window where she can see the garden we have in the yard. Not that it's much of a garden in the middle of winter, but, you know. The most surprising part is that I am completely not creeped out by the doll. And dolls usually leave me feeling very unsettled in general, haunted or not. So far, I think we'll keep her. Something happened when I was camping 20 years ago, and I can't get it out of my head. I was visiting my uncle and cousin Sarah in rural Pennsylvania. I was about 16 and Sarah was about 12. Sarah asked me if we could go camping, which to her meant pitching a tent at the top of this huge foothill that was on the property. The foothill was very steep and had woods at the top. I'd never been camping before then, but I figured if anything happened, we could just walk back down to the house, so I said, cool, no problem. We pitched the tent so the woods were directly behind it, with the tent opening facing out toward the scenery and the view. We roasted marshmallows, told campfire stories, and got into the tent around 11 p.m. or midnight. Sarah fell asleep right away, but I couldn't, so I was just lying there, counting sheep. Suddenly, I heard leaves shuffling in the woods behind the tent, and I heard footsteps coming out of the woods behind the tent as well. There were a few steps, then it would stop, then a few more. As it got closer, I heard it step on some large rocks. It sounded like a really large hoof step on the rock because it made that clomp sound like a horse does. As it got closer to the tent, I could feel the impact of each step on the ground under me, so whatever it was very heavy. At first I thought it was a large buck, and I debated waking my cousin up so she wouldn't miss it. But then it kept coming closer and closer to the tent, closer than any deer or buck would have. And suddenly I was overcome with this feeling of full-body dread, like something was very, very wrong. Then I heard a really bizarre sound. It sounded like it was coming from about 8 to 10 feet off the ground. And the best way I can describe it is like someone had a huge roll of masking tape and was pulling off a big section at a time. It was this odd tearing sound, for lack of a better word, and each tearing sound was loud and lasted 2 to 3 seconds. I told myself it was a deer and that it was tearing bark off the trees, and that's what was making the noise. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to risk waking Sarah because it would scare her, so I just lay there as quietly as possible, praying that whatever it was would leave. But instead of leaving, the tearing sound got closer, still about 8 to 10 feet off the ground. Now it was directly behind the tent, within about 5 or 10 feet. Right then I heard Sarah scream whisper my name, and I realized that she was awake and heard it too. She asked me what it was, and I told her it was fine, that it was just a deer, and to go back to sleep. She said, "That doesn't sound like a deer." But I insisted it was, because I was too scared to make a run for the house with whatever this thing was right outside. So we listened to it slowly move around the tent, from left to right, still close, still making the sound every few seconds. And then, things got even weirder. It started moving around to the front of the tent, where the ground dropped off steeply, so each few feet forward was also several feet down. As this thing went around to the front, the sound stayed at the 8 to 10 foot height, and was slowly moving to the right. Now, if the thing making this sound was standing on the ground, it should have dropped several feet, but the sound stayed at the same height all the way around. I even wondered if it was a bird, but it was moving too slowly, and that wouldn't account for the footsteps or hoofsteps that I heard before. After the sound and hoofsteps faded into the woods, Sarah and I just lay awake the rest of the night, too afraid to leave the tent. At first light, we booked it back to the house and told my uncle what had happened. Even though he didn't know what it was, he just shrugged and didn't seem too concerned. But that experience scared me so much that I've never been camping since. I know I didn't hallucinate it or imagine it because Sarah heard it too. Has anyone else ever heard of anything like this? I've asked friends who are avid outdoorsmen, hunters, trackers. None of them has ever heard of anything like this. Some people have suggested that this was a moose, but as far as I know, there aren't any in Pennsylvania. When I looked it up, it said that the last ones disappeared in the 1700s. And two, that tearing sound that it made stayed at the same height all the way around the tent. Like I said, if it was any sort of physical animal, it would have dropped a few feet when it walked in front of the tent. But maybe my logic is off. I don't know. But something was definitely off that night. Growing up, I had a childhood friend that lived relatively close by. We were like two peas in a pod. We were both adventurous, believed in the paranormal, enjoyed astronomy, and generally just being outside. She was born in Alaska, and her dad had lived there for quite a while, so they were always into camping, hiking, fishing, skiing, you name it. It was with my friend's family that I got introduced to fishing and did a lot of camping. This happened during the mid to late 90s, and we were maybe around 10 to 12 years old. It's been a while, so I can't remember exactly. One camping trip, we went to this lake in the forest that was surrounded by a meadow, and feeding the lake was a small stream leading out of the woods. Anyway, we played in the meadow and the stream all day while my friend's dad fished. The lake wasn't very big, and because it had a meadow all around it, he could keep an eye on our whereabouts while he fished. While messing around by the stream, the wooded area it was coming from gave me weird vibes. I can't explain it. I just felt really uneasy. Anyway, the day faded away into early evening, and it was time to leave and find a camping spot. My friend's dad picked up his fishing gear, and we all walked back to the truck on this long, winding path through the woods. Once in the truck, we drove into a more remote area of the forest and made our way up this steep road that was so rough and at such an incline that I was convinced that my friend's dad was going to break his truck. He had a 4, maybe 6-cylinder Toyota pickup that was about as basic as a truck could get. In fact, I'm not even sure if the truck had 4-wheel drive, but being an Alaskan outdoorsman with years of experience, I trusted him. We finally made it up to the top, which was flat and relatively open, with a big area of forest in the opposite direction from the road we drove up. We pitched our tents, got everything set up, and my friend and I decided to go explore the area. We were maybe 50 yards from the tent when we heard a big crack as a tree branch snapped in the woods behind us. We got quiet and looked in that direction, but didn't see anything. Thinking it was just a deer, we brushed it off. As we were walking, we heard it again, and whispered to one another about what it could be, but kept going. It stopped briefly, and when we were about 200 yards from our camp, we sat on a boulder looking down the steep wooded hill, overlooking the dirt road from where we'd come. Suddenly we heard another cracking branch from behind. Whatever it was seemed to be following us. Our imaginations going wild, we came up with everything from a serial killer stalking us in the woods, to deer, to Bigfoot. When we got back to the campsite, we told her dad what we had heard and how it seemed to be paralleling us. He kind of played it off as a black bear and secured all the food. Later on, my friend confided in me that her dad had gotten out his pistol and would be sleeping with it that night. My friend and I were sharing one tent, and he was in his own tent not far from us, so we figured everything would be okay. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to hear something or someone walking outside. As I lay still, listening, I could hear it quietly circling the tent. It sounded like it was walking on two legs, because it had a distinct rhythm in how it walked. Whatever it was, it sounded big. I could hear its weight, if that makes any sense, as it put each foot down and walked. I could even hear relatively quiet but deep, heavy breathing at times. As I lay there listening, I could hear it wandering to the other parts of the campsite, and then back to our tent, almost as if it was walking in a big repetitive loop. This went on for who knows how long. Felt like an eternity. Terrified and unable to wake my friend, I lay there and listened until somehow I eventually fell asleep. The next morning I told my friend and her dad about it, but I don't know if they believed me or not. Interestingly, absolutely nothing in the camp was disturbed in any way. The ground was not very soft, and in some places was covered in grass, so there were no footprints either. This is something that I have never been able to explain, and to this day lingers in the back of my mind whenever I can. I will always wonder what it was that walked around our tent all night. I have started with a new routine, so I bought a bike. Decided that I would go on an 11 p.m. to midnight stroll before heading home to sleep. Suffice to say I didn't after this. There's a canal system in Glasgow perfect for cycling, so I followed it quite far out, with my light and bell at the ready, in case I crossed paths with someone. Although that's probably not likely, given the time of night. I got off my bike at a bench. Behind this bench there's a brick wall, and behind those bricks were disused railway tracks, decommissioned in the 1950s. My phone started to play up, and the light from my phone seemed a bit weaker than usual. I followed the light across the muddy canal, and to my horror, I saw what looked like a boy and a girl in the small island in the middle. I asked if they were okay, but I didn't get much of a response. I asked again if they needed my help, or if I could call the fire brigade or police or whatever. Just as I said that, my phone died. I now only had the moonlight to go on. Remembering the light from my bike, I turned it on and scanned the area again. There was no one there. Thank God nothing came out of this, other than that. I was absolutely shitting myself on the way home. I cycled home and freaked out a bit, turned my phone on, and when I got home, it had 61% battery. So what the hell happened? Nobody believes me, but I guess I don't expect them to. I would like to know what the heck I saw, though. This happened about a month ago. I was riding my bike back to my house after going to Dunkin' Donuts. A normal day, as I would think. I was going past an entrance into a neighborhood. I was driving relatively slowly, due to the fact that I was going up a hill. I saw a girl walking into the neighborhood. Though she looked strange, nothing very different was really apparent. She was pale and had black hair. I kept staring at her just to make sure she wouldn't walk toward me. Something was just so unsettling, even though there was nothing obvious just from looking at her that should make me feel that way. At the second I was about to turn my head, she jerked her head around to face me, and at that moment my heart sank to my feet. Her eyes were pitch black, and her nose was weirdly pointy. She smiled very widely at me, and then started to walk toward me, her smile fading as she got closer. I realized what was happening and basically biked away as fast as I could. I turned my head to make sure she wasn't following me, but all she did was turn back into the neighborhood. Now I use a different route to go to Dunkin' Donuts. The reason? I'm terrified she'll return unexpectedly. At that time I knew about black-eyed kids. I knew what would happen if she came near me. So, I guess my point is, be careful when biking near neighborhoods. I grew up in Saugus, California, on Copper Hill. I've had several paranormal experiences while living there. I've had things thrown at me. I've seen full-body apparitions. I had a milk carton crushed in front of me, and had an unplugged vacuum cleaner turn on. My parents, whom I live with, had their own experiences as well, such as seeing an entity, or just having a general unease in the house. I guess I'm just reaching out to those who may know the area, because this stupid house haunts my dreams to this day, and it's been 18 years since I lived there. I told a story before here, expressing my concerns for a house that I lived in 18 years ago. I wanted validation that maybe the area itself was haunted, and I wasn't the only one being tormented. Turns out a lot more people responded than I initially thought would. Some wanted a more detailed account of the happenings within the abode, so here we go. Let me start off by stating that there were numerous occurrences. So many that I'm only going to share the big ones. Some smaller events were hearing my mother's voice when she wasn't home, general unease throughout the entirety of the house, and my younger brother's room seeming to be in a permafrost even when it was over 100 outside. His electronic toys would go off on their own as well. I would hear "I am the Dark Knight" in the middle of the night on some occasions from his talking Batman toy. That part was kind of hilarious looking back on it now. Just for quick info, I was between the ages of 6 and 12 when I experienced all this madness, and I am now 30. The first occasion I want to talk about is a shadow that I encountered. It was probably around 7 in the morning. I was eating breakfast at the dining table before school. I had made myself a bowl of cereal and left the milk out on the counter of our kitchen. From the dining table, I had a clear view of our entire kitchen. As I was eating, I started to feel that nasty unease that I so often felt. I looked up from my bowl and into the kitchen, and I stared in horror as I saw a black mist enter the kitchen and move toward the counter where the milk carton was. As the mist started to dissipate, the milk carton on the counter was crushed, the cap flying off, and what remained of the milk exploding everywhere. My father, who was a very abusive and angry man, walked into the kitchen and started screaming at me for making the mess. I just stared at the table. I didn't even try to defend myself. What was I supposed to say? A shadow crushed it? The second experience I'll elaborate on is being tormented in my room. There was one night in particular where I stayed up late, as I often did. I was a fearful child. I was staring at my bedroom door. I could sense that unease, and I tried my best to make myself comfortable. As I continued to stare at the door, I felt my blankets tug toward the lower corner of my bed. As I sat up in terror, the corner of my comforter lifted and started shaking violently, as if my blankets were going to be ripped off. I was so mortified that I went to scream, but nothing came out. I've never experienced that before or after. It brings even more fear because you can't call out for anyone in that state. Finally, I did manage to yell for my parents with a raspy voice. They came into my room as the shaking stopped, and searched it to make sure that there weren't any intruders, or that our cat wasn't scaring me. They found nothing. On other occasions, I've had my rocks from my rock tumbler thrown at me as I ran out of my room. And I've seen small shadows darting in and out of mine and my brother's rooms. The last incident that I'll mention was probably one of the last experiences that I had before moving. I was about 12, and I had just gotten home from school. I was a latchkey kid. I went straight for my back living room. I had 2 living areas, as a lot of houses in the area had at the time. Maybe they still do, I don't know. I plopped down on the couch and turned on my television. There was a vacuum sitting next to the TV. My puppy joined me. Suddenly I got that weird feeling again. I tried my best to ignore it, but my puppy started whimpering and ran to the back door that led to the backyard. I called to her, desperately trying to deny that anything was going to happen. She progressively got louder in her cries and started scratching at the back door, something that she'd never done. I stood up to go get her, and as I did, I saw a mist form next to the vacuum. I thought maybe it was just dust puffing up from the bag, and I walked toward it to investigate. As I got closer, the vacuum suddenly turned on, startling me. It turned off within a few seconds, and I thought maybe it was a power surge. I investigated further, only to discover that the cord wasn't even plugged in. Needless to say, I grabbed my puppy and stayed at my neighbor's house until my parents got home from work. I don't know if anybody who lives in Saugus can tell me what happened. I don't know if the land is haunted or if it was just the house. Either way, it haunts me to this very day. This definitely isn't the creepiest story ever, but it's still something that I think back on every now and again. I often wonder to myself, had I not listened to what my parents had told me, what would have happened? This happened to me a few years back, when I was 5. I was a pretty active kid. I'd go outside and play anytime I got the chance to do so. That being said, because it was the summer, I had every intention to run around outside, pretending with the toy guns and all that. Here's a couple of things you should know about the property I live on. Number 1. There's a fairly large pond to the north of our home, only about 200 feet, that you can easily get to on foot through a small forest between our house and the pond. There are several methods of getting to and from it, as we've cleared several paths over the years. Number 2. We live in a pretty rural area. We're close to other homes, don't get me wrong, but as far as we know, past our house, everything to the north is a few miles of unexplored wilderness. Number 3. We live 100 feet from my grandmother's home. My parents had gone out that day. My dad was at work and my mom was out getting groceries. I couldn't tell you where my grandfather was if I tried, but at that time we were staying with my grandmother for a couple of hours until one of our parents got home. My brother had laid down for a nap. He was 2 at the time, and I decided to go out and play. My grandmother told me to stay close to the house, so I did. As unrealistic as it sounds, I knew even at that age that there were bad people in the world, and being the fact that we lived just down the road from an apartment complex, and we would frequently see junkies and other riffraff walking down the road in front of my grandmother's house, I knew this all too well. Something else that's notable. My grandfather would frequently take me over to that pond to fish. He'd always catch monstrous catfish, while I stuck to my sunfish and bluegills. But we had a rule that was absolutely stressed to my little brother and I from a young age. Do not go over to the pond unless there's an adult with you. Even at 5, I knew the dangers of being alone in the wilderness without an adult with me. But even then, and today, We knew for a fact that people would frequently trek from that apartment complex across to where the pond is to go through a small field to the east, and would follow the road into town from there. So I was outside playing with a toy gun or something, doing the general things that a 5-year-old would do, mouth sound effects and all, when all of a sudden something stopped me. I heard a voice. As far as I knew, I was the only one outdoors at the time. Then I heard the voice for the second time, and couldn't quite make out what it was saying. I checked the back and front door of my grandmother's home just to make sure it wasn't her. It wasn't. Then I heard the voice a third time, and I knew where it was. It was coming from my house, but no one was there, and I knew this. So curious 5-year-old me wandered the 100 feet to my home and started snooping around. I should mention that this voice was yelling something unintelligible from a distance, not screaming, more calmly yelling. I heard the voice a fourth time halfway there, and I stopped dead where I stood. The voice wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from toward the pond. But what was more, the voice sounded exactly like my mother's. I knew for a fact that my mother wasn't home, and my grandmother was inside her house. The eeriest part of it all was that the voice was yelling my name. The voice was just yelling, "Jack!" over and over again. They'd yell once, and then they'd stop for about 5 seconds, and then yell again. Knowing that my mom wasn't home at all, I couldn't figure out who the voice could be, or why they sounded just like her. Curious, after another time of hearing my name being called, I called out, "Yeah?" in response. A few moments of silence followed this, a few seconds longer than before. Then, finally, the voice called out my name again, and again I replied. And, like clockwork, I heard my name being called out again and again coming from the woods toward the pond. After this, I turned around and headed back. I don't know why. I wasn't creeped out, I wasn't scared, I was just confused. So I told my grandmother, but she chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe somebody was in the woods calling out to someone else. Or maybe it was an animal, making a sound that I misinterpreted to be my mother calling my name. Regardless, I know that I was convinced then, and even now, I'm still convinced, that it wasn't my imagination. So why do I think it was a skinwalker? Well, I'd only heard about people having experiences with skinwalkers and sharing them. But I never really looked into it much, but about 2 years ago, I was listening to a video by Lazy Masquerade on YouTube. I heard a story about a person's experience with a skinwalker. The legend goes that skinwalkers can't form entire sentences or speak altogether, only names and sometimes small phrases, and they can mimic other people. We still live on that property, and I've never experienced anything like this ever again. It's definitely one of the weirder things that has ever happened to me.